We are conditioned by centuries of lore and ceremony to view royalty as a performance of perfection, a life lived in the stately, predictable rhythm of procession and succession. We admire these figures for their unwavering poise, their silent commitment to a destiny they did not choose, but rather inherited like a priceless heavy crown. But these are not the portraits that truly hold our gaze, not the ones that burrow into our memory. The images that truly haunt us are those where the surface begins to crack, where the composed smile fails to reach the eyes, and a profound unspoken agony lurks beneath the polished veneer. Today we resolve to look past the ornate gilded frame and delve deep into the turbulent, tragically misunderstood, and profoundly sorrowful life of one of the 19th century's most enigmatic and misrepresented royal figures. She was a woman born at the absolute apex of European dynastic power, the first grandchild of one of history's most powerful and enduring empresses, and the elder sister of one of its most infamous and consequential emperors. By every right of birth, she was destined for a life of immense influence, unimaginable wealth, and critical dynastic duty. Instead, her entire existence became a relentless 59-year battle against an invisible, insidious enemy. A war waged not on the burgeoning battlefields of a rapidly industrializing Europe, but within the silent, lonely, and private chambers of her own body and mind. She was transformed by a mysterious and agonizing affliction, not into a figure of compassion or sympathy, but into a court scandal, a difficult and rebellious daughter, a cold and neglectful mother, and a willing, often dangerous political pawn. Her greatest agonies were not endured in the face of public catastrophe, but in the silent, lonely hours of the night, in the hushed, whispering corridors of German palaces where her suffering was consistently and cruelly dismissed as madness, manipulation, or feminine weakness. Her reign was not over a kingdom, but over a vast private empire of inescapable pain. Yet this epic, deeply personal tale of suffering does not end with a cathartic moment of clarity or a long-awaited vindication. It concludes not with a crescendo, but with a long, heartbreaking descent into obscurity, a life story completely overshadowed by the cataclysmic collapse of her entire world. It is a final tragic movement that would see her outlive her family's empire, her own social and political status, and the very concept of the life she was meticulously bred to inhabit. This is the story of Princess Charlotte of Prussia, later the Duchess of Saxe-Meiningen, a woman whose famously sharp wit and scandalous tongue concealed a lifetime of unimaginable torment. A princess whose shocking behavior was, in retrospect, a desperate primal cry for help, and a medical ghost whose story tells us more about the brutal limitations of 19th century medicine and the silent, invalidated suffering of women than any official court biography ever could. Join us as we uncover the astonishing, heartbreaking, and profoundly human story of the princess who was dismissed as a hysteric and the devastating unseen truth that was hidden all along in her blood. To truly comprehend the intricate, shadowed labyrinth of Princess Charlotte's life, one must first step into the very specific world she was born into, a world of immense, earth-shaking promise, of fervent intellectual fire, and of suffocating, unyielding expectation. Victoria Elizabeth Auguste Charlotte came into the world on the 24th of July, 1860, at the Neue Palais in Potsdam, a sprawling Baroque masterpiece commissioned by Frederick the Great. Her birth was not merely a royal event. It was a potent dynastic statement, a symbol of a future that many hoped would reshape the continent. She was the first daughter and second child of Crown Prince Friedrich of Prussia, the thoughtful, bearded, and profoundly liberal heir to the German throne, and his wife Victoria, known affectionately to her family as Vicky. Vicky was no ordinary princess. She was the Princess Royal of Great Britain, the fiercely intelligent, artistically gifted, and politically astute eldest child of Queen Victoria. Charlotte was, therefore, the very first grandchild of the formidable Queen of England, a living, breathing symbol of the powerful, and, as history would prove, deeply complicated union between the two great Protestant powers of Europe, Great Britain and the rising state of Prussia. Her exalted parentage placed her at the dramatic intersection of two vastly different and often conflicting worlds. Her father, Friedrich, was a sensitive, deeply cultured man who harbored a passionate, lifelong dream of ruling a more liberal, democratic, and constitutional German empire, one modeled not on Prussian militarism, but on the British parliamentary system he so admired. Her mother, Vicky, was her father's intellectual equal, his most ardent supporter, and his staunchest political ally. She was brilliant, fluent in multiple languages, a talented painter and sculptor, and a woman steeped in the progressive, enlightened values of her beloved father, the late Prince Albert. She had arrived years earlier in the rigid, austere, and deeply militaristic court of Berlin like a gust of fresh, invigorating air, determined to cultivate an oasis of art, literature, liberal philosophy, and scientific inquiry within the cold, stony confines of the Hohenzollern monarchy. The very atmosphere in their home at the Crown Prince's Palace was thick with a palpable sense of ambition, not for power in its own right, but for the power to create a better, more peaceful, and more enlightened Germany. Into this crucible of high-minded, almost utopian ideals, Charlotte was born. And from the very beginning, it was clear to everyone that something was profoundly, inexplicably wrong. She was not the placid, biddable, and intellectually curious infant her highly demanding parents had hoped for. She was a difficult, perpetually agitated baby, prone to long fits of screaming and seemingly immune to comfort. As she grew from infancy into childhood, these troubling traits only intensified, carving out a chasm between her and her family. Charlotte became a profoundly challenging child. She was, by all accounts, startlingly hyperactive, perpetually anxious, and given to sudden, inexplicable fits of violent temper that shocked her caregivers. Her mind, though undeniably quick and sharp, was restless, unfocused, and seemed incapable of sustained concentration. She was a whirlwind of raw, untamed nervous energy, a habit that manifested in a host of deeply unsettling ways. She bit her fingernails compulsively until they bled. She would compulsively tear at the seams of her clothes, and she struggled to sit still or apply herself to the rigorous English-style lessons her mother meticulously prescribed for her. Vicky, a demanding intellectual who had triumphed through discipline and force of will, was utterly baffled and deeply personally frustrated by her eldest daughter. She had envisioned raising a child in her own mirror image, studious, disciplined, morally upright, and artistically inclined. Instead, she was faced with a child who seemed to instinctively and willfully defy her at every single turn. In her voluminous and at times painfully honest letters to her own mother, Queen Victoria, Vicky catalogued her daughter's perceived failings with a heartbreaking mixture of raw despair and utter bewilderment. She described Charlotte, or Charlie, as she was called, as a queer, wild little thing, a child who was so nervous and sensitive. She lamented Charlotte's voracious appetite for gossip and mischief and her disturbing lack of interest in any serious subject. The sacred bond between mother and daughter, which should have been one of loving guidance and mutual affection, rapidly degenerated into a relentless battle of wills, a vicious and unending cycle of maternal expectation and childish rebellion that would leave both women deeply and permanently scarred. The household that Vicky and Friedrich painstakingly created for their large brood of children, Charlotte, her slightly older brother Wilhelm, the future Kaiser Wilhelm II, and their 6 younger siblings, was explicitly designed to be an antidote to the cold, emotionally sterile, and brutally formal upbringing typical of German royalty. It was intended to be a place of vibrant intellectual stimulation, where English was spoken as freely and as often as German, and where the children were expected to engage with art, history, politics, and science from a young age. But for Charlotte, this enlightened environment felt less like a nurturing sanctuary and more like a high-pressure, suffocating prison. She recoiled from her mother's relentless academic demands, preferring frivolous, empty chatter and the intoxicating thrill of court intrigue to dry discussions of philosophy and literature. She seemed to instinctively align herself with the diametrically opposed world of her conservative, anti-intellectual Prussian grandparents, Emperor Wilhelm I and Empress Augusta. They, in turn, doted on their spirited granddaughter, indulging her whims and subtly encouraging her defiance of her liberal parents, which created a further, almost unbridgeable rift within the family. Compounding these complex behavioral issues was a constant and bewildering state of ill health. From her earliest years, Charlotte was plagued by a seemingly endless litany of mysterious and debilitating physical complaints. She suffered from crippling headaches that would leave her listless for days, persistent and painful toothaches, chronic and severe digestive problems, and a vague but pervasive sense of nervous agitation that never seemed to leave her. However, in an era when the inner lives of children were poorly understood and female ailments of any kind were frequently and casually dismissed as mere affectation or emotional weakness, her genuine suffering was not met with sympathy or serious medical inquiry. Her parents, her tutors, and the succession of court physicians who examined her largely came to a consensus. She was a hypochondriac. They believed she was feigning illness to escape her lessons, or, more cynically, to garner the attention that she so desperately seemed to crave. This was the first and perhaps the most enduring tragedy of Charlotte's life. Her genuine, searing physical pain was consistently interpreted as a moral failing, a fundamental weakness of her character. She learned from a very young age a devastating lesson, that her own suffering was not to be believed. This difficult, painful, and emotionally fraught childhood took place against the backdrop of monumental and violent historical change. When Charlotte was just 11 years old, following Prussia's stunning and decisive victory in the Franco-Prussian War, her grandfather was proclaimed German emperor in the hallowed Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. She grew up in the very heart of a new, immensely powerful, and deeply confident German empire. But this was a victory for the conservative, authoritarian, and militaristic vision of Germany, a state forged in blood and iron by the formidable Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. It was the absolute antithesis of the liberal British-style monarchy that her parents so passionately dreamed of. As a result, the crown prince and princess became increasingly isolated, politically impotent figures within the very court they were destined to one day lead. And Charlotte, in her tumultuous teenage years, made a fateful and calculated choice. She sided not with her embattled, idealistic, and progressive parents, but with the powerful and manipulative chancellor. She became a willing instrument in the court's endless political games, a purveyor of secrets, and a spreader of malicious gossip that often served to directly undermine her own mother. It was a classic, if extreme, act of adolescent rebellion, but one that carried profound and damaging real-world consequences. By the time she reached womanhood, Charlotte was a beautiful, famously witty, and deeply unhappy young woman, utterly estranged from her mother and desperate to escape a home that had never once felt like a refuge. Her chance at freedom, she passionately believed, would come with marriage. But it would prove to be no escape at all, merely a trade of one gilded cage for another. In the rigidly codified and deeply pragmatic world of 19th century European royalty, marriage was rarely a matter of the heart. It was a strategic transaction, a dynastic merger, a continuation of diplomacy by other, more intimate means. For Princess Charlotte, however, it represented something far more personal and urgent, a declaration of independence. At the tender age of 17, she eagerly and almost desperately embraced the prospect of matrimony as a way to finally liberate herself from the suffocating intellectual and emotional dominion of her mother. Her chosen husband was Prince Bernhard of Saxe-Meiningen, the hereditary prince and heir to a small, respectable, and culturally significant, but decidedly provincial, German duchy. Their wedding, which took place in Berlin on the 18th of February, 1878, was a grand imperial affair, a glittering multi-day spectacle attended by the highest echelons of royalty from across Europe, including the future King Edward VII of the United Kingdom. As Charlotte, radiant in a gown of white satin and lace, walked down the aisle of the royal chapel, she was not just becoming a wife and a future duchess. In her own mind, she was staging a daring and triumphant jailbreak. Prince Bernhard was, by all contemporary accounts, a kind, decent, and sensible man. He was a dedicated and competent soldier who had served with distinction in the Franco-Prussian War, and he possessed a deep scholarly interest in history, particularly Greek archaeology. He was a serious, steady, and thoroughly dependable figure. He was also, in every way that mattered to the rebellious Charlotte, the complete and utter opposite of the charismatic intellectual and often overbearing men of her immediate family. He lacked her father's philosophical brilliance and her brother's bombastic, almost theatrical charisma. In Bernhard, Charlotte found not a kindred spirit or a passionate love, but something she valued far more at that moment, a safe harbor. He was a means to a very specific end, the key that would finally unlock the cage of her childhood. The devastating problem, which she would discover all too quickly, was that the world outside that cage proved to be crushingly, soul-destroyingly dull. Life in the sleepy, respectable ducal court of Meiningen was a brutal and immediate shock to Charlotte's restless system. She had been raised at the very epicenter of European power in the dynamic, politically charged, and socially cutthroat atmosphere of Imperial Berlin. Meiningen, with its quiet cobblestone streets, its formal but small-scale court, and its highly intellectual but subdued cultural life, felt like a provincial backwater, a form of living death. Ironically, the Duchy of Saxe-Meiningen was home to the Meiningen Ensemble, one of the most famous and artistically innovative theatrical companies in all of Europe, which toured the continent to great acclaim. Yet even this beacon of high culture failed to capture Charlotte's interest. She was utterly suffocated by the profound, inescapable boredom. The prescribed duties of a consort in a minor duchy, patronizing local charities, hosting tedious official dinners, and making endless rounds of polite conversation with local dignitaries, held absolutely no appeal for her. Her restless, stimulation-seeking mind, which craved drama, intrigue, and novelty, found no purchase in this tranquil, well-ordered world. The marriage, which had begun with a conspicuous lack of emotional connection, soon became a hollow, empty vessel. Charlotte and Bernhard discovered they had almost nothing in common. While he was content with his military duties, his historical studies, and the quiet administration of his future duchy, she craved the high-voltage thrill and malicious intrigue of the Berlin court. The birth of their one and only child, Princess Feodora, in May of 1879, did absolutely nothing to bridge the ever-growing chasm between them. By her own admission, Charlotte possessed no maternal instinct whatsoever. Having received so little genuine warmth or emotional understanding from her own mother, she found she had none to give to her daughter. She viewed the child not with love, but as a profound nuisance, an anchor tying her to a life, and a man she had come to despise. She frequently, and without remorse, left Feodora in the care of nannies and governesses for weeks and sometimes months at a time. It was a pattern of severe emotional and physical neglect that would have devastating and tragic consequences for her daughter's own fragile mental and physical health in the years to come. Charlotte's solution to the crushing ennui of her marriage and the responsibilities of motherhood was brutally simple. She left. As often as she possibly could, she began to spend more and more time away from Meiningen, engineering a constant stream of extended visits to Berlin, to health spas, or to seaside resorts. It was in Berlin that she truly came alive, throwing herself headlong into the one activity that seemed to bring her genuine, albeit fleeting, joy: the high-stakes, vicious game of court society. With her famously sharp tongue, her insatiable appetite for secrets, and her utter and complete lack of discretion, she quickly became the undisputed queen of Berlin gossip. She held court in her lavish apartments, hosting risque parties and intimate gatherings where she would trade rumors and innuendos with a fawning circle of courtiers, dissolute aristocrats, and ambitious politicians. She was a recognized master of the subtle barb, the well-placed rumor, the mischievous and destructive half-truth that could sow discord, ruin reputations, and create delicious, intoxicating chaos. This was far more than just idle, frivolous chatter. In the politically supercharged atmosphere of Bismarck's Germany, Charlotte's drawing room became a veritable center of political intrigue. She deliberately and publicly cemented her alliance with the powerful Iron Chancellor, often sharing private family information and letters from her mother that could be used to politically undermine her liberal parents. Her relationship with her brother Wilhelm, who shared her conservative politics, and her deep-seated animosity towards their parents grew even stronger. Together they formed a powerful reactionary bloc against the crown prince and princess, creating a toxic, deeply divided, and paranoid atmosphere at the very heart of the imperial family. Her mother, Vicky, watched in abject horror and despair as her own daughter deliberately transformed into one of her most effective and ruthless political enemies. But behind the glittering, brittle facade of the witty, scandalous, and carefree socialite, the specter of her mysterious illness was a constant, menacing, and inescapable presence. The move to Meiningen had done nothing to alleviate her physical suffering. In fact, as she entered her 20s and 30s, it grew demonstrably worse. The familiar litany of complaints continued unabated: excruciating migratory pain in her limbs, chronic and severe digestive issues, debilitating periods of severe insomnia, painful skin problems including rashes and boils, and crippling bouts of what was then vaguely termed neurasthenia, or nervous exhaustion. These were episodes of profound, almost paralytic depression and anxiety, where she would completely retreat from the world, overwhelmed by a deep, dark melancholy that no amount of social distraction could penetrate. Her life became a dizzying, destructive, and exhausting cycle. She would seek out frantic, almost manic periods of social stimulation in Berlin, only to inevitably collapse from sheer physical and emotional exhaustion. She would then retreat to various exclusive spas and sanatoriums across Europe, Baden-Baden, Cannes, Biarritz, in a desperate and always futile search for a cure. She consulted dozens of the most eminent doctors in Europe who offered a bewildering array of diagnoses, from a wandering womb to chronic pelvic inflammation, and prescribed an equally bewildering array of treatments, ranging from hydrotherapy and brutal rest cures to more dubious and dangerous electrical therapies. Yet no one could identify the root cause of her profound and multifaceted suffering, and so the old painful narrative from her childhood persisted and hardened. She was not truly sick, but merely a difficult, manipulative, attention-seeking woman, a classic and incurable case of female hysteria. To cope with the unrelenting physical pain and the deep emotional anguish of being constantly disbelieved and dismissed, Charlotte began to rely on a dangerous and ever-increasing cocktail of medications. She became dependent on powerful sedatives like chloral hydrate to sleep, and most critically, on morphine to dull the ceaseless pain. This tragic descent into addiction was not a moral failing or a search for pleasure. It was the desperate, logical act of a person in agony, using the only tools available to her in a pre-scientific age. But it was a path that would only lead her deeper into the shadows, further isolating her and cementing her reputation as an unstable, unreliable, and scandalous figure, all while the true, terrifying nature of her illness remained a locked, impenetrable box. For decades upon decades, Princess Charlotte's life was tragically defined by the unbridgeable chasm that existed between the reality of her symptoms and the absence of a diagnosis. To her frustrated family, her baffled doctors, and the gossiping court, she was a frustrating, infuriating enigma, a woman whose body and mind seemed to be in a constant state of chaotic rebellion without any discernible organic cause. Her suffering was undeniably real and intense, but its source remained stubbornly invisible, leaving it perilously open to interpretation as a weakness of will, a manipulative personality, a fundamental flaw in her character. It is this specific part of her story, the long, lonely, and deeply isolating battle against an unnamed and unseen foe, that constitutes the central, heartbreaking tragedy of her existence. And it is only with the clarifying, powerful lens of modern medicine that we can finally unlock the secrets she carried within her and afford her the compassion and understanding she was so cruelly denied in her own lifetime. As Charlotte progressed through her 30s and 40s, the relentless, insidious progression of her illness became impossible for even her most skeptical relatives to completely ignore. The vague but persistent complaints of her youth coalesced into a nightmarish, ever-present constellation of chronic, debilitating, and truly bizarre symptoms. She was in a state of near-constant, often migratory, pain. She frequently described a burning, searing, or stabbing sensation in her abdomen and limbs that was so excruciatingly severe it would leave her completely bedridden and screaming for days on end. This agony was accompanied by severe and unpredictable gastrointestinal distress, terrifying episodes of partial paralysis or extreme weakness in her legs, and a frightening, painful sensitivity to light. Her skin, once praised for its fine, pale beauty, became prone to inexplicable rashes, blistering, and a strange mottled reddish discoloration. The unrelenting physical torment was matched and often surpassed by the devastating psychological toll. The periods of neurasthenia became more frequent, more profound and more dangerous, plunging her into deep suicidal depressions that would last for weeks. These dark episodes were often followed by periods of intense agitation, severe anxiety, mental confusion, and even terrifying bouts of paranoia, where she would lash out at those closest to her, convinced of elaborate plots and conspiracies against her. This was the terrifying, unpredictable, and chaotic reality of her daily life. She was utterly trapped in a body that felt like a medieval torture chamber, her mind a raging storm of anxiety, pain, and despair. Her ever-increasing addiction to morphine and other opiates was not a recreational indulgence or a sign of moral weakness. It was a desperate, moment-to-moment attempt to silence the screaming of her own overstimulated and malfunctioning nerves. One must try to imagine the profound, soul-crushing isolation of this state, to be in constant, excruciating, and very real pain, but to be told repeatedly and condescendingly by your husband, your mother, and your doctors that it is all in your head, to feel your own mind fracturing under the unbearable strain of it all, only to be labeled as hysterical, difficult, or mad. It was a living nightmare, a gilded prison where the bars were forged not of iron, but of her own malfunctioning biology and the suffocating ignorance of her era. The definitive key to understanding this lifelong nightmare would not be discovered for nearly a century after her death. It was the groundbreaking work of the eminent British historian John C. G. Reuel, along with other dedicated medical researchers who, while meticulously combing through the vast, newly opened royal archives of Germany and Great Britain, unearthed a devastating and undeniable pattern. By painstakingly studying the private letters, diaries, and detailed medical records of not only Charlotte, but also her mother Vicky, her daughter Theodora, and even her distant ancestor King George III of Great Britain, they proposed a stunning and compelling diagnosis that fit the evidence like a key in a lock. Charlotte was almost certainly suffering from a rare and debilitating genetic disorder known as porphyria. Porphyria is a group of complex metabolic disorders caused by a faulty enzyme in the multi-step biochemical pathway that produces heme, a vital iron-containing compound that is a critical component of hemoglobin in the blood. When this intricate process goes wrong due to a genetic mutation, toxic chemical precursors called porphyrins build up in the body, wreaking havoc on the central and peripheral nervous systems, as well as other organs. The documented symptoms of acute intermittent porphyria, the specific type that Charlotte most likely had, match her historical medical records with a chilling and absolute precision. These symptoms include severe diffuse abdominal pain, often mimicking appendicitis or other surgical emergencies, severe pain in the limbs and back, muscle weakness and paralysis, severe anxiety, paranoia, hallucinations and deep depression, chronic insomnia, and extreme skin sensitivity. Even the reddish or dark purple tint that sometimes appeared in her urine, a classic but often overlooked diagnostic sign of a porphyria attack, was noted by her doctors, who dismissed it as insignificant. This powerful medical revelation is not just a minor historical footnote. It fundamentally and irrevocably recasts Charlotte's entire life story. It transforms her, in an instant, from a historical villain into a tragic victim. Her famously difficult childhood, her hyperactivity, her emotional volatility, and her inability to concentrate were almost certainly the early neurological manifestations of this insidious disease. Her mischief-making and frantic search for social stimulation can be reinterpreted as a desperate, lifelong attempt to distract herself from the constant, low-level discomfort, pain, and anxiety that simmered just beneath her surface. Her hypochondria was not imagined. It was the perfectly accurate, if medically baffling, articulation of real, terrifying, and scientifically inexplicable pain. Her reputation as a neglectful mother and a difficult wife must be completely re-examined through the compassionate lens of a woman struggling with a chronic, agonizing, and multi-systemic illness that impacted every single facet of her physical and mental health. The porphyria diagnosis explains everything. It also casts a long, tragic, and undeniable shadow over her entire family. The genetic trail of this autosomal dominant disorder is undeniable. Her daughter, Princess Feodora, lived a life that was a tragic, almost carbon copy echo of her mother's. She suffered from the exact same mysterious suite of symptoms, was also dismissed by doctors as a neurotic and a hypochondriac, and ultimately, in 1945, took her own life, a final desperate surrender to a lifetime of misunderstood and untreatable pain. Furthermore, it is now widely believed by most medical historians that the famous madness of King George III, Charlotte's great-great-grandfather, was in fact not a psychiatric illness at all, but a series of severe, untreated attacks of porphyria. The disease was a dark, hereditary curse, a shadow lurking in the royal bloodline, passed down silently through generations, claiming victims who were cruelly punished and institutionalized for their illness rather than ever being treated for it. Charlotte's story becomes, therefore, a devastating and powerful indictment of the profound limitations and inherent biases of 19th century medicine, particularly concerning the health of women. The term hysteria, derived from the Greek word for uterus, hystera, was a ubiquitous catch-all diagnosis used by male doctors to dismiss any number of female physical and psychological complaints that they could not readily explain or understand. It was a label that effectively silenced women, invalidating their lived experiences and attributing their genuine suffering to a defective, wandering, and inherently unstable female nature. Charlotte was one of the most prominent victims of this pervasive medical misogyny. She was a princess with access to the most famous and expensive doctors in all of Europe. Yet not a single one of them was capable of looking past her gender and her difficult personality to see the complex, devastating biological disease that was systematically destroying her life from the inside out. She was trapped not only by her illness, but by the unshakable dogmas of a medical world unable to look beyond its own prejudices. While Charlotte waged her silent, desperate, and lifelong war against the insidious enemy lurking within her own body, the grand, seemingly unshakable world she had been born into was marching inexorably towards its own spectacular, bloody, and violent disintegration. Her deeply personal tragedy unfolded on a vast and opulent stage that was itself set for a world historical catastrophe. The German Empire, which had seemed so permanent, so powerful, and so invincible at its founding in her childhood, was in reality a young and volatile creation, and its ultimate fate was inextricably linked with the complex ambitions, deep-seated insecurities, and fatal flaws of her own immediate family. The brief 99-day reign of her father in 1888 became a moment of profound, tantalizing, and ultimately lost hope for Germany and for Europe. When the old Emperor Wilhelm I finally died at the age of 90, Charlotte's parents, Friedrich III and Victoria, finally ascended the imperial throne they had waited for decades. They were the great hope of liberal Germany, poised at last to steer the powerful empire away from the precipice of militarism and towards a peaceful, progressive, constitutional monarchy. But it was tragically too late. Friedrich was already dying of throat cancer, and his reign was a silent, agonizing, and tragic whisper. His death in June of that same year brought Charlotte's arrogant, impulsive, and deeply conservative brother to the throne as Kaiser Wilhelm II. The liberal dream, so long nurtured by their parents, died with their father. The so-called Year of the Three Emperors was a turning point, and Germany took a darker path. Under Wilhelm II's erratic, insecure, and bombastic leadership, Germany became more aggressive, more nationalistic, and more diplomatically isolated. Charlotte, despite her often strained and competitive personal relationship with her brother, was politically and ideologically aligned with his conservative, anti-British court. She remained a fixture in Berlin society, a sharp-witted observer, an occasional meddler in the high politics of the Reich, though her influence waned as her health grew ever more precarious. Her life continued its established, destructive pattern, periods of frantic, almost manic socializing in the capital, inevitably followed by complete physical and mental collapses into illness, and long, costly retreats to sanatoriums and health resorts. In 1914, when her husband's cousin abdicated the ducal throne, Bernhard finally succeeded, and Charlotte at last became the reigning Duchess of Saxe-Meiningen. It was a title she had waited for over 36 years, but it came at the very moment the entire world of German princes, dukes, and kings was about to be utterly and permanently obliterated. The outbreak of the First World War in August 1914 was the beginning of the end. The intricate, interwoven web of royal cousins that had governed Europe for a century, including Charlotte's own first cousins, King George V of Great Britain and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, tore itself apart in a horrifying frenzy of industrial slaughter. For Charlotte, the war was a profound personal and political rupture. Her deep-seated loyalty was, of course, to Germany, but she was also the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, and the conflict severed the last remaining emotional ties to her British heritage. The world she knew had turned on itself. The war years were a period of steep decline and growing isolation for the new Duchess. Her health, always precarious, deteriorated sharply under the immense strain and privations of the conflict. The severe food and medical shortages of wartime Germany exacerbated her condition, and reliable access to the potent drugs she had come to depend on became more difficult. She spent most of the war far away from the public eye, a pale and suffering ghost haunting the luxurious but somber health resorts of Germany, while the mighty empire her family had built bled to death on the battlefields of France, Belgium, and Russia. The final stunning collapse came with breathtaking and shocking speed in the autumn of 1918. Defeated on the battlefield and facing a full-blown communist revolution at home, the German monarchy crumbled in a matter of days. On the 9th of November, Kaiser Wilhelm II was forced to abdicate his throne, fleeing ignominiously into exile in the neutral Netherlands. In the chaotic days that followed, all of Germany's other ruling kings, grand dukes, dukes, and princes, including Charlotte's own husband, Bernhard III of Saxe-Meiningen, were unceremoniously swept from their thrones by a powerful wave of popular revolution. In a single world-altering stroke, Charlotte and her husband lost absolutely everything: their titles, their status, their vast royal properties, their fortunes, and their entire reason for being were summarily erased by the new socialist republic. They were no longer royalty. They were simply Mr. and Mrs. von Meiningen, ordinary private citizens in a defeated, broken, starving, and deeply humiliated nation. The fall was total and absolute. The glamorous world of palaces and protocol, the universe of dynastic certainty and divine right that had defined her entire existence, had vanished as if it had never been more than a dream. The complex web of European royalty, the very family that had both nurtured and tormented her, was shattered beyond all repair. Her Russian relatives, the Romanovs, had been brutally murdered by the Bolsheviks. Her German relatives were deposed, disgraced, and scattered in exile. Her British relatives were now the triumphant victors in a catastrophic war that had utterly destroyed her home. For a woman whose entire identity was predicated on her royal birth and status, this was a form of profound psychological death. The external world had finally, violently, come to mirror the chaos, pain, and disintegration that she had always felt raging within. She was a refugee in her own country, a forgotten relic of a lost and discredited age, living out her final painful days in a world that no longer had any place for her. The last year of Princess Charlotte's life was a quiet, desolate, and painful epilogue to a story filled with noise and anguish. Stripped of her rank, her purpose, and much of her family fortune, she lived in a state of stateless, identityless limbo, a ghost of the imperial past adrift in the turbulent, violent new world of the Weimar Republic. The grand stage upon which she had played her controversial and often scandalous role, the glittering palaces of Berlin, the exclusive salons of high society, the intricate dance of European diplomacy, had been irrevocably dismantled. All that remained for her was the pain, the constant, unwelcome, and lifelong companion that had stalked her for nearly 6 decades. She retreated to Baden-Baden, the elegant and famous spa town nestled in the Black Forest, a place that had so often served as a temporary refuge from both her debilitating physical ailments and the incessant demands of her royal life. It was here, in the dreary, uncertain autumn of 1919, that her long and torturous struggle finally came to its end. On the 1st of October, Princess Charlotte, the former Duchess of Saxe-Meiningen, died of a heart attack. She was 59 years old. Her death was not a major news event. In a new Germany reeling from the collective trauma of military defeat, economic collapse, and political revolution, the passing of a minor, deposed, and largely unpopular royal was of little to no consequence. She died much as she had lived, fundamentally and completely misunderstood. The official cause of death was a heart attack, but in truth, her death was the inevitable culmination of a lifetime of systemic collapse, a body and a mind finally worn down to nothing by an unrelenting, undiagnosed disease and the corrosive long-term effects of the powerful medication she had used to fight it. Her legacy, for the vast majority of the 20th century, was a cruel, one-dimensional, and deeply inaccurate caricature. She was remembered, if she was remembered at all, as Charlie, the difficult princess, the malicious and untrustworthy gossip, the cold and unnatural mother, the neurotic, scandal-courting troublemaker. She was relegated to a disparaging footnote in the biographies of her more famous relatives, a difficult and disappointing daughter for the heroic Empress Frederick, a frivolous and politically toxic sister to the notorious Kaiser Wilhelm II. She was presented as a cautionary tale, a classic textbook example of a hysterical royal woman whose life was nothing more than a series of self-inflicted scandals, imagined illnesses, and petty complaints. This simplistic and damning narrative, first set in place by the understandable frustrations of her own mother, and then solidified by decades of court gossip, became her official historical epitaph. But the modern, science-based discovery of the porphyria diagnosis has allowed for a profound, necessary, and long overdue rehabilitation of her memory. It demands that we look back at her life not with judgment, but with deep and informed empathy. Her story is no longer that of a moral or personal failure, but of a devastating and inescapable medical tragedy. She becomes a powerful and poignant symbol of the countless women, particularly in the 19th and early 20th centuries, whose genuine physical and mental suffering was callously dismissed, invalidated, and psychologized by a patriarchal medical establishment that viewed the female body as inherently defective. She is a testament to the unique and terrible agony of the unseen illness, a condition that profoundly isolates the sufferer and often invites the scorn and disbelief of a world that cannot comprehend a pain it cannot physically see. The most poignant and heartbreaking element of her legacy, however, lives on through the tragic story of her only child. Princess Feodora, who inherited not only her mother's illness, but also the deep scars of her mother's pattern of neglect, lived a life of even greater and more concentrated tragedy. After an unhappy marriage and a lifetime of battling the same terrifying demons of chronic pain, depression, and medical dismissal, she died by her own hand in 1945. Feodora's final desperate act serves as a terrifying confirmation of the genetic curse that haunted this branch of the royal family, a dark and inescapable legacy of pain passed down from mother to child. So what, then, is the final enduring meaning of the princess who was never truly understood? First and foremost, her story is a stark and powerful reminder of the inherent fallibility of the historical record. The stories we are told, the judgments passed down through memoirs, letters, and contemporary accounts are often woefully incomplete, colored by the personal biases, emotional conflicts, and profound scientific ignorance of their time. Charlotte's life teaches us to question the easy, often misogynistic labels placed on historical figures, especially women, and to seek the deeper, more complex, and often hidden truths of their lived, embodied experiences. Her legacy is also a profoundly human one. It is at its core a story about pain, not the grand, heroic, and public pain of a soldier on the battlefield or a monarch facing abdication, but the quiet, chronic, invisible, and deeply personal pain of a body at war with itself. She reminds us that the greatest and most difficult battles of a life are often fought in silence, far from the public eye, and that survival in the face of such a relentless internal battle requires a kind of strength and endurance that is often invisible and therefore uncelebrated by the outside world. She was a woman who was denied the very language to accurately describe what was happening to her, yet she somehow endured it for 59 long and difficult years. The life of Princess Charlotte of Prussia is, in the end, an unseen portrait. The image that was presented to the world, the one that has been passed down through history, was that of a sharp, scandalous, and difficult woman, a flawed, glittering jewel in the imperial crown of Germany. But the true portrait, the one that reveals the unvarnished and agonizing reality of her existence, was hidden from view, locked away in the mysterious, malfunctioning chemistry of her own blood. Her story concludes not with the triumphant resolution of a life finally understood, but with the quiet, lingering tragedy of a truth that was revealed far, far too late to bring her any peace. To view her life solely through the narrow, judgmental lens of her behavior, her incessant gossip, her reckless political intrigues, her undeniable maternal failings, is to completely miss the staggering, almost unimaginable scale of her lifelong suffering. It is to fail to appreciate the profound and compassionate truth that her story ultimately uncovers, that a person's true character is not defined by their often flawed reactions to overwhelming pain, but by the dignity and resilience they somehow managed to show in the face of it. Charlotte's life was a desperate 59-year search for relief, a frantic, chaotic dance to outrun a shadow that was an inescapable part of her very being. The core of the tragedy is that no one around her ever saw the shadow. They only saw the chaotic, disruptive dance, and they judged her for it. Her life challenges our very definition of royal biography. She was a woman born to the pinnacle of immense privilege who lived a life of profound and unrelenting torment. She was a princess surrounded by the greatest medical and scientific minds of her age, yet she was utterly and completely condemned by their collective ignorance and their ingrained prejudices. She was a wife and mother who was seemingly unable to give or receive love, perhaps because the relentless, all-consuming battle for her own day-to-day survival consumed every single ounce of her emotional and physical energy. Her story is a necessary, stark, and uncomfortable reminder that history is not just a grand, orderly chronicle of wars, treaties, and royal successions. It is also shaped by the silent, invisible, and often cruel forces of biology, by the random genetic lottery that can bless one person with health and vitality and condemn another to a lifetime of incomprehensible agony. It is the story of a disease that moved like a ghost through the corridors of power in one of the most powerful families in the world, leaving a devastating trail of madness, misery, and misunderstanding in its wake. In remembering Charlotte, we are forced to look beyond the glittering, deceptive frame of royalty and confront a messy, painful, and far more heroic human reality. We see not a caricature of a hysterical princess, but a woman of immense misunderstood strength, a profound and lonely victim of her time and of her own DNA. She is a ghost in the grand, tragic saga of the Hohenzollern dynasty, a dissonant, painful, and sorrowful melody in the imperial anthem. She was the princess that history dismissed, but she remains and will forever be a powerful, tragic, and unforgettable testament to the unseen battles that lie hidden just behind the carefully composed portraits of the past.